Hi, everybody. It's Friday, April 11th, 2025, and our friend Mark Sleboda is back with us. Welcome back, Mark.
Nima, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Dialogue Works, and I'm just glad you could fit me in with the other 15 interviews you'll be doing today.
Mark, let's get started with what's going on in Moscow, where you live, and what's going on with Steve Witkoff. What does he want from Vladimir Putin, in your opinion?
Um, I don't know. First of all, these Steve Witkoff is Trump's personal envoy of choice, right? He has been sent to deal with things with the Israel-Palestine issue. I have heard that he has been sent to Oman to deal with the U.S. Iranian talks mediated by Oman. He
Which is
has
tomorrow.
Yes, tomorrow. He has been negotiating with Russia as Trump's go-to when the U.S. and the Russians met for the first time, and it was 3-on-3, and the idea of equivalent ranked members on each side. So we had U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Although, frankly, comparing Mark Rubio as a diplomat versus Lavrov is not a fair comparison. He's a political hack, and Lavrov is the most experienced and formidable diplomat in the world of this generation, and probably I think you have to go back to figures like Molotov and Bismarck to find his equal anywhere. But there was also Mike Waltz as U.S. National Security Advisor, and Yuri Ushakov, whom is Putin's personal foreign policy advisor. So roughly, equivalent there. And then Trump sent his personal envoy, Steve Witkoff, right? And he is the one who has actually been talking to the Russians the most on other occasions as well. And who is Steve Witkoff? So, he's a storied diplomat. He's been at the State Department for decades. No, he hasn't. No, he's got no diplomatic experience whatsoever. He's got no education in anything of the sort, international relations, nothing. He's got nothing. He is a New York real estate developer friend of Trump. Trump trusts him. That's it. I mean, I've heard people describe him as charming, as I don't know. He seems like a used car salesman, frankly, to me. All right, he's kind of slimy. I don't know. But so you have to weigh these things here. With Trump's choice of him, he's got no experience, right, dealing with the most crucial issue of our times, right? Because the conflict in Ukraine has become a global order changing conflict, right? Out the other side of it, in the middle of it, yes, but even more so out, whatever the end game of it indeed looks like. And the U.S. has got someone with no experience, no real knowledge of Russia. A couple of weeks ago, he couldn't even remember what the Donetsk and Lugansk Republic names were, and Kherson and Zaporozhye and Crimea. There's a few of them, right? He doesn't. Little details, right? And of course, one of Russia's demands is that those 5 regions at a minimum are all now part of Russia. So you think that the top negotiator would, might have a handle of this, but details, schmetails, right? Trump doesn't need any of that. He can make a deal. The art of the deal. It's high diplomacy, geopolitics, New York real estate, mafia tactics. It's the same thing, right? Okay. But on the other hand, now obviously I've been expressing nothing but contempt for Steve Witkoff in that regard. But there is something to be said for this choice. Trump doesn't trust anyone within the U.S. blob, as Ben Rhodes called it, the foreign policy and security elite, in and out of office, right? The deep state, the permanent bureaucracy, whatever you want to call it. Trump's at war with these people, right? And a political war internal in the U.S. And particularly after his first administration, he doesn't trust any of them, right? Does he really trust Marco Rubio? No, probably not, right? The Mike Walt, it's Witkoff, right? Witkoff is the guy he keeps shuttling back and forth. And Russia's equivalent choice, all right, who Putin selected interestingly as the equivalent of Witkoff is Kirill Dmitriev. Kirill Dmitriev is the head of Russia's direct investment fund, right? It's not a government position. It's actually a civilian business role, right? An administrative business role. It's not the same as the American Chamber of Commerce, but as you could think of him as the chair of that fund in a similar way. And he's U.S. educated. Yeah, he received some not completely, but he received some higher education in the United States. He speaks fluent English. As people who saw him, he was just in the White House over a week ago. And they went on U.S. media afterwards, where they asked him about, the possibility of Russia, giving concessions in Ukraine in return for sanctions relief, and he was like, he shattered their brains, right? He said, no, not really. It's not a priority for us. Our economy is doing fine, growing at 4% GDP last year, better than you, better than the Europeans, right? A lot of Russian businesses have done very well after the Americans and Europeans left the market, right? We are now the most sovereign major power in the world, probably the most sovereign country in the world, right? You can't uh, hold us hostage and blackmail us again with your sanctions, with your control of SWIFT and the global financial architecture. If you want to, you want to come back into our market. That's a favor for you. We can discuss that, right? But it's not a priority for us. We have goals of the SMO. That's our priority, and that kind of shocked them, right? Because that's not the way the Western media presents it. But that was, I think the first time that the American public really saw Kirill Dmitriev. Interestingly enough, Kirill Dmitriev was actually born in Ukraine, right? He was born in Kiev, and Zelensky has declared him a traitor separatist and ordered his arrest because, that never mind the fact that he's a Russian citizen now. Now he was born in Ukraine and now he's a traitor, and so he must be dealt with because the regime that Zelensky leads, the Maidan regime, has assassinated, murdered thousands of East Ukrainians, right? Of Ukrainians who didn't agree with the 2014 US backed Maidan putsch and everything that has happened since, right? Militia leaders, politicians, activists, administrators, anyone, right? I mean, they've killed hundreds. It's got to be up into the thousands. And then they're quite proud about it. It was openly admitted by Budanov and others, right? The Ukrainian military intelligence was rebuilt from the ground up by the CIA, effectively as an assassination machine, right, to kill dissidents, Ukrainian dissidents. Now, Kirill's not a dissident, he's long since become a Russian, but that doesn't stop Zelensky from regarding him as a traitor. And he's not the only one. Alexei Zabritsky is currently one of the Russian cosmonauts on the International Space Station, right? But Zabritsky, young guy, for the role, very accomplished. he was born in Zaporozhye. And he went to a military academy and became a pilot in Kharkov, and then served in the Ukrainian military as a pilot. Well, when 2014 happened and Crimea had the referendum to return to Russia, the majority of the Ukrainian Navy and Air Force, right, they defected to Russia, right? Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty even had, I'm sure it's out there somewhere still, a video report on it where they admitted that 75% of the Ukrainian Navy defected to Russia, right? And he was one of them, right? And he was good as a pilot, and he earned trust, and he made accomplishments, and he was selected for cosmonaut training, and he was selected to actually be sent into space. And Zelensky regards him as a traitor and a deserter, right? Obviously, he should be, conscripted and sent to the front in the trenches like everyone else, right? And he has ordered his arrest, right? So obviously, the Ukrainians are gonna, I don't know, jet up to the International Space Station and put Zabritsky in handcuffs any day now. It's madness. The man is mad. He hates Russians. He admitted it, and these people self-identify as Russians. And Lavrov pointed out today, how can we let this man govern any ethnic Russians or pro-Russians or Russian speakers in Ukraine? He said that he has hatred for them and that it fuels him, despite the fact that he, of course, is a native Russian speaker himself. Right? He speaks Ukrainian, not very well. It's not his mother tongue. He made his comedic fortune in the Russian language. You can't even show his movies without having them dubbed over in Ukraine today. But that is who Zelensky is. So I mean, Zabritsky, Dmitriev, they fall in the same category, and Dmitriev, again, is the equivalent of Witkoff, someone that Putin trusts but is seen as a business person who can speak the language of Witkoff and Trump. And now Witkoff is in Moscow, and it's not hard to guess that he is being sent to try to jumpstart relations, right? There was just another meeting in Istanbul at a diplomatic technical level that is going through the arduous process of correctly restoring diplomatic function between the two countries that were down to skeleton crews and harassment of of the diplomats and everything. And they're negotiating things like Russia is demanding the diplomatic territory that was, according to the Russian point of view, illegally seized under international law by the United States, by the then Obama administration. And there's also a question of banking, like simply for the diplomats to be able to, have an account and buy things and so forth. And the Americans, they want the right to hire Russians citizens to work at the U.S. embassy in Moscow again. These are, boring things for most people, right? I mean, that's not what you're tuning in to hear about the conflict and geopolitics. And U.S. and Russia right now are haggling over banking rights for diplomatic, units and hiring locals to do embassy functions and things like that. I mean, that's what's going on. And as far as any peace settlement goes, right, that's dead. I mean, the first ceasefire, quote unquote, the electrical energy infrastructure, the Kiev regime is essentially violating it, if not every day, then every other day. And I think I saw a headline today that they violated it 5 times the day before, right? So obviously that's, Russia is still going through the motions, I guess, with the intent of pleasing Trump and or proving to him that we're serious about this ceasefire. But the reality is, of course, is that Russia doesn't need to hit the Kiev regime's energy infrastructure. It usually launches its missile salvos with like a month in between them, right? When it does assessment and finds out, what it needs, what they are able to repair, what they're not, what it able need to hit next. So 30 days, they can finish that up. And then point out that it's the Kiev regime who doesn't want peace. The reality is that no one wants peace except for the United States, right? At this moment, right? And they want peace to save a U.S. proxy regime in Kiev. That's why they want peace, because they lost this war. The U.S., NATO, the Kiev regime proxies lost this war against Russia, or if not lost it, are well on the way to losing it, right? With no real hope of altering that capability, unless some type of deal is cut, right? Some peace settlement to save it. That's why Russia, the Kiev regime, Europe, they all want peace, but only on their own terms, right? If it's not their terms, they have no interest in peace, and so the Black Sea Initiative, the grain deal 3.0, right? Russia asked for is, okay, when there was an original grain deal, we were promised a degree of concessions from the West, things like reconnecting Russia's agricultural bank to SWIFT, making it possible to get maritime insurance for its ships, because, well, if the issue is getting grain to the world, especially the developing world, Ukraine was the fifth biggest exporter of grain in the world. When this all started, Russia's number one, right? They have a lot more grain, right? A lot more. They're also number one in fertilizer, by the way, and these other things. And they're like, if this is supposedly out of humanitarian concern for the world food markets, we're all on board that. But we're a much bigger part of that than Ukraine. So you need to stop your, all your sanctions instruments that inhibit us from getting our grain and fertilizer to global markets that need it, our agricultural products. And the West, of course, never fulfilled those agreements, right? Once again, they broke the terms of a deal brokered with Russia and laughed all the way to the bank, right? Now the Europeans are refusing to meet any of these conditions, right? And the SWIFT banking system is in Belgium, and Europe has considerable say, along with the US, and what happens there. And the question of maritime insurance, that's mostly out of London, right? That they still run the majority. Now, Russia and India and other countries have been getting into it now, but it would make it much easier to be done via the big established insurance giants in the field that are more, say, reputable, or have a degree of trust, long term business, and so the UK said no, right? And the same issue with ports and the like. So that's also dead in the water. The Europeans are stymied that, and right now there is no scheduled meeting that I'm aware of, that I don't think anyone's reported on, between Russia and the U.S. Between officials of Russia and the U.S. to discuss the conflict in Ukraine. They're not doing that, right? Russia and the U.S. are working on improving bilateral relations. That's what this meeting in Istanbul, a second meeting on the issue of diplomatic work, restoring basic diplomatic functions. That's what that's about. And Russia is considering these two tracks, right? On one hand, it's bilaterally improving relations with the US as much as is possible, taking this window of opportunity with the Trump administration, right? And on the other hand is a diplomatic settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, right? And as far as Russia's concerned, it should only be limited overlap between those two issues. And if this one doesn't work out, well, we should still try to improve relations otherwise, because there's a whole bunch of other things, crises in the world that Russia and the US should and really need to talk to each other about, like the US threats of bombing Iran, right? Unless, yeah, Iran agrees to a deal with the man who ripped up the last deal that Iran had with nuclear deal with the United States, right? The JCPOA. So, Russia, can serve as an intermediary in that regard. They are a new improved strategic partner of Iran. So Russia is making the condition. And I think to talk about what Witkoff is doing here, right? With the bilateral relations bogged down in the minutia of restoring basic diplomatic functions, right? And the peace, the ceasefires, the peace, settlement going nowhere, and the Russians increasingly saying, "Well, look, you're not even talking about the root causes of the conflict. We're not interested in a general ceasefire, right? That doesn't, do proper work in that, at least towards that, right? And you're not even talking about that." So I think Russians see that the lack of experience, or lack, also, I would have to say, of a unified position within the Trump administration on the issue of the conflict in Ukraine, leaves the thing, it's dead in the water right now. And I think Witkoff is making some personal appeal to Putin. He's meeting Putin personally. And that's something, because who is Witkoff? He's the New York real estate developer, right? He's not a diplomat. He's not a minister. He's not a president. He's Trump's gopher, right? Or if you want, his trusted personal envoy that is getting to meet the Russian president again, according to some reports. And I think that Trump is increasingly getting desperate. It doesn't seem that everything he's doing is working out so well. His global war of tariffs on the world, he's walking it back now, except for on China, after not just the U.S. Stock market, but I think perhaps more importantly, the bond market tanked, right? The value of the dollar fell, everything, and now he's like, yeah, I'm going to give you a 90-day extension on that, right? 90 days, and they could extend that even further than 90 days, except for China, because China, and China resisted us and replied tariffs back, tit for tat, and that really made Trump angry, because the other superpower in the world was just supposed to bow down, and to use Trump's words to describe how the leaders of most of the world were coming to him to, quote unquote, kiss my ass and promise me anything, sir, please remove these sanctions. That is the contemptuous way that the president of the United States spoke about the leader of nearly every other country in the world. Um, that's not going so well. His threats to bomb Iran. Yeah, Iran is talking now, but I really doubt that they're going to get what they want from Iran, right? Because, well, nominally, what people are talking about is they want. Iran doesn't have an active nuclear weapons program, right? They enrich uranium. They have a nuclear domestic industry, which is their right under international law, under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, as a non-nuclear country. But the U.S. and Israel, are now saying, you can't have any nuclear enrichment whatsoever, right? You're because you're Iran and we don't like you. And that would supposedly prevent breakout. But I think also that what the Trump administration wants is, it wants to demand that Iran stops any relationship, any support for the Ansala movement in Yemen, for the Houthis, for Hezbollah in Lebanon, for Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq and Syria. They want them to knock everything off, right? And of course, they want Iran to drop the axis of resistance, right? Their support for Shias, throughout the Middle East, and Iran, of course, is not going to do that. So that also leaves those negotiations in jeopardy, shall we say, in a point of tension. And well, I have to say that my gut, I reading Trump is hard, right? And God knows I've been wrong about Trump, about some specific things in the last few months. So I think overall, uh, uh, I wouldn't say that I've been terribly off the mark, just at various points along the line. But it is difficult. But I think he's bluffing. I think he's bluffing. I don't think he wants a war in the Middle East, right? I don't think the U.S. has enough air defense missiles now to fight Iran, right? With Iran able, with a significant missile and drone capability that they have demonstrated, that can reach out and hit every U.S. military base, the hundreds of them, in the Middle East and in the area, Israel, and so forth. And I don't think the U.S. can defend them, right? They certainly can't defend Israel from a concentrated. And Iran has their own nuclear option of mining or otherwise blocking traffic through the Persian Gulf, which would tank the world. Well, not tank, but raise oil prices, through the roof, right? Because so much of the daily oil trade in the world goes through the Persian Gulf. So I don't think Trump really wants that. Trump seems pretty focused. If you check, this supposedly leaked U.S. threat assessment and everything, they want to be laser focused on China, right? That's what they see as the threat. They want the stuff in Ukraine to go away, but they can't seem to come up with an actual way to save face and U.S. interests and get out of that, right? They want Iran to just quiet down in the Middle East so that they can then deal with China, right? That's what they want to focus on. But that's what every U.S. president has wanted since Obama, since his pivot to Asia. And every one of them gets bogged down in the Middle East and with Russia and everything else. And then that military pivot to confront China never quite happens, right? And if the U.S. began air missile strikes on Iran, that any potential war with China in the Taiwanese Straits and the South China Sea that the U.S. might seek to provoke there, China just got a 5 or 10 more years to prepare, because the U.S. would exhaust. I think they're already. We already know how short they are. Again, particularly this Achilles heel of a shortage of air defense missiles, and that for a system that the Patriot, that I think has serious questions as to its actual effectiveness, as demonstrated in Ukraine as well. So I think Trump, he's flailing domestically right now, with so much upheaval coming as a result of the tariffs, walking back some tariffs. But U.S. consumers are going to feel the bite just of this 10% across the board tariffs, and the, I don't know, the 5 billion percent, what is it, 125 now, or 145 against China. Amazon's CEO just put out a warning. 70% of Amazon's goods are sourced from China.
Wow.
70, yeah, 70%. So obviously the U.S. consumer is going to be feeling the bite very soon, right? And Trump's got to win midterm elections. If he doesn't win midterm elections, then he won't be able to get much done for the next the remaining 2 years of his administration. He'll be probably be fighting another impeachment, right? Because that's the lawfare, the way the U.S. works now. So he's got to find some way to salvage the domestic situation. He wants to pivot to China, but now he's looking at a trade war with China developing, and seems pretty clear that what he really wanted was China to just bow down and cut a deal with him on his terms. I don't know why he thought that the Chinese would do that, but the man is, you know, I I don't think hubris is his literal middle name, but it really should be. He is a self-aggrandizing, narcissistic megalomaniac, and that's being nice. He's just got a lot of problems, and it would be nice if he could get some type of progress on this Ukraine thing, right? And all the time, Russia's like, yeah, hard diplomatic work ahead, months and months, small steps, right? And he's getting frustrated. He thought he was going to have a handshake and a deal, and the war would be over, and a U.S. proxy regime saved, and Putin would be happy just to be invited back to the club. And that's
Mark, let me read what he has tweeted, what he has put on his social media. It says Russia has to get moving. Too many people are dying, thousands a week in a terrible and senseless war. To which direction he wants to move Russia? He wants Russia to move, and what is that direction in the mind of the Trump administration and Trump himself?
yeah. He wants a ceasefire. He wants a period where the guns stop so that the West can rearm and resupply, and they can continue to mobilize and save the Kiev regime. That's what he wants. Oh, the people are dying. Yeah, the people are dying in Yemen too because you're bombing them, right? And you're threatening to bomb Iran. Don't give me this bleeding heart. Don't pretend that Trump is some type of humanitarian. That's just sick, right? We're talking about the guy who assassinated Qasem Soleimani in Iraq with a number of top Iraqi generals, by the way, as well, right? This Trump as a peacemaker is just absolute pablum, right? I mean, you really have to be a Trump fanboy, mindless drone to take any of that seriously. But that's what he wants, right? He wants a deal that will, maybe frozen conflict, a ceasefire leading to a frozen conflict to give time for the situation to change and for him to focus on other things because he doesn't want to deal with this. And, Russia's not interested in that. Russia's been very specific. They're not interested. They want a final settlement that meets all the terms of the SMO and solves what they regard as the core causes of the conflict before the guns stop, right? And Trump wants the opposite. So they're kind of at loggerheads, and Russia is preparing to launch major offensives in the next month or two, right? We're going to see huge numbers of new troops. The Kiev regime says that Russia has 150,000 troops, some 15 divisions, right? Trained up, equipped, not yet part of the SMO, but waiting, right? I think it's very likely that they will be injected. The Ukrainian Kiev regime certainly thinks so. The question is where? Zaporozhye, Sumy region, somewhere else, right? These are all possibilities, and a lot of it depends on where the Kiev regime shuffles what troops it has left around the battlefield and so forth. But Russia is, yeah, we'll talk, but we're going to continue fighting, right? They don't buy, the Trump is insisting, but in order for any diplomatic work to happen, there has to be a ceasefire. No, that's not true at all. I mean, it wasn't true when you negotiated a deal with the Taliban in Afghanistan. It wasn't true in Vietnam or Korea for the United States either. Negotiations in Vietnam went on for years while fighting went on. So no, that's not true. We're not going to give you, we've been down this road before. Minsk 1, Minsk 2, you just, retrain and rearm and come back again. That's not going to happen this time. And the Europeans, at least the British and the French, are threatening that as soon as there is a ceasefire, they're going to put their troops, i.e., NATO troops, on the ground in Ukraine. Right, Russia's, and I think part of that calculation is, of course, saying that, well, they know that Russia would never accept that, and they want to prevent any ceasefire from happening. That's why they're so loudly talking about this, even as British generals, British brass, speaking to the Telegraph on condition of anonymity, said that this is political theater and they have no ability to send troops that could deal with Russia on the ground in Ukraine. Right? I mean, at best, human tripwire, but even then, there's a question about their ability to even sustain a human tripwire deployment in Ukraine. That's how bad the British and French militaries really are. I mean, you can call them paper tigers, but that's not right, because even on paper they look like, I don't know, decrepit Yorkies or something, right? Like some kind of disabled Yorkie. I don't know. So Trump is desperate. He wants some type of deal, but Russia's in the driver's seat, right? He's himself has at times admitted that Russia has all the cards. And they're not interested in helping Trump save face or pivot to deal with other issues domestically or elsewhere that he would rather deal with. So Russia is, we'll talk, but in the meantime, until we get what we want, we're just going to continue on the battlefield. And Putin spoke to a group of sailors in Murmansk a couple of weeks ago, and he spoke about we think it is possible, right? There's a probable chance that we could finish the Kiev regime forces off this year, right? That was very specific language that he was using, right? So that of course leaves Trump in a bind. What does he do, right? Does he escalate to de-escalate? How does he do that, right? More sanctions? Yeah. You could go from 18,000 and some to 19,000 and some. Russia's, not really. It's all pointless at this point, right? All sanctions are now is sanctioning the rest of the world, right? Secondary sanctions to try to force them to stop trading with Russia. It hasn't worked out so well. It's not that countries defy it. It's just they work around it, right? Loopholes are always found. Loopholes are always made, whether we're talking India or China or, the global South, whoever, even the Greek oil industry, the shipping, they find ways of that ships run into each other in the middle of the night, and some oil is just transferred from one ship to the other, and that sort of things happen. So, and militarily, I mean, what else does the U.S. have that the assessment from the Director of National Intelligence, the group assessment of U.S. intelligence across the board, came to the conclusion that there is no current or future weapons package that the U.S. could deliver to Ukraine that would change the fact that Russia has the advantage, a severe advantage on the battlefield. That was admitted, by by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence just a few weeks ago. So, I mean, the Trump administration is aware of that. They can make things tougher. They can drag things out. They can make it bloodier. But at the end of the day, They're not going to change that reality. The reality of a war of attrition where Russia's military industrial complex is geared up and outperforming the entirety of the West, the entirety of NATO, by, as Mark Ruda has pointed out, by more than 3 times. And the Russian troops are motivated, right? Sierski just admitted today that the size of the Russian military is growing, right, every month by several thousand troops, right? I mean that's net, losses, new troops coming in, and they're growing by several thousand troops every month. And of course, he's lamenting that they can't really keep up with that. So, I don't think that there's really. I think that both sides, particularly the Trump administration, will go through the motions of continuing. Talks about ceasefires, about peace settlement, and everything. But at the end of the day, Putin is very politely saying, "Niet," is saying no to Trump. And Trump would like to walk away, but he's simply no US president, not even him, no matter how much contempt he has for Zelensky, no matter how much contempt he has for Europe's leadership, right? No matter how much he doesn't care about Ukraine in the big scope of things, he's still the US president and he can't accept Russia's terms, right? The Kiev regime is a U.S. proxy state, and he has to find some way. I'm sure that some part of him would like to walk away, wash his hands, say this is Biden's mess, but he hasn't given any real indication that he has that political will, that he would be willing to expend the necessary amount of domestic political capital to do that. So that leaves them in a bind, and the conflict goes on, and it will go on, for some time, even without the U.S. Sending new weapons packages. Right, the U.S. is still sending arms to Ukraine every month, right? Because a great deal of these arms packages that Biden sent were not just for things off the Pentagon's shelves, but long-term contracts with the U.S. military industrial complex, that as it's produced monthly, it gets sent over to Ukraine. Whether we're talking ammunition, vehicles, drones, whatever, that's ongoing. And the Europeans are talking about accelerating things. I don't know whether we can, but Germany just promised another multi-billion-dollar military package to Ukraine in the last 24 hours. Now, if you read the details of that, that is through 2029, right? And I don't know if there is going to be a Ukraine left in 2029, to be perfectly honest, right? But they're still have the intention of trying to make up for the U.S. if the U.S. doesn't deliver any new aid packages. Again, it could make things longer, make things bloodier, more costly for Russia, but unless they get a black swan, then which is essentially, I guess, what they're hoping for. One thing I wanted to bring up back on the issue of tariffs and this mafia style way of dictating, forcing negotiations to right. Trump has figured out that the neoliberal globalization that the U.S. the system that the U.S. built globally over decades, right? Free trade system doesn't work for U.S. interests anymore. I mean, that's been known for quite some time. Capital flows moving from west to east. U.S. companies, running to Asia and source of cheaper labor, so forth and so on. The collapse of U.S. manufacturing and industries being laid perfectly clear in this conflict, and their inability to jumpstart their military industrial complex to meet this challenge. That um, the U.S. Is just demanding that the rest of the world renegotiate the terms of global trade to benefit the U.S. now. All right, and it's a mafia. You want to call it madman theory? Where Trump says plays mad, and everyone will, according to him, come running and kiss his ass. Um, it's He has reached the conclusion that U.S. hegemony, right, is too expensive, right? And what's one of the most interesting details about that is it's emerging that the thought inside the Trump White House, inside the Trump admin, is not that the U.S. should therefore give up the pursuit of hegemony and primacy. It's that the rest of the world should pay for it and be glad to pay for it, right? And this was put out by Mirren, whom is Trump's the chairman of Trump's the Council of CEPA, Economic Policy Advisors, right? And he spoke this week in defense of the tariffs and about the tariffs, and he said that they were to collect money, right, to read this renegotiation of global trade on U.S. terms is to pay for U.S. global public goods, right? That the rest of the world should help pay the burden sharing cost of. And what they identified is number one, the U.S. military, its network of hundreds of military bases around the world. The ones that they send into countries willy nilly. Whenever they feel like it. That's a global public good, and the rest of the world should pay for their military overmasters, right? And the second was the use of the dollar as the global reserve currency. That's expensive. That requires the U.S. to run trade deficits and the like, and that's too expensive, right? And you should pay, the rest of the world should pay the U.S. for the privilege of using the dollar, right? That's now, never mind that Trump himself has threatened to destroy BRICS if they dare to even think about creating an alternative currency, and everyone has to have the dollar force. That contradiction, of course, never really occurs to them. And the fact that they can run $37 trillion national deficits and onto the moon because the dollar is the currency of global trade still, for, well, not for Russia anymore, but for much of the rest of the world. You should pay for that privilege. That's what they're saying. That's what the tariffs are for. The tariffs are so that the U.S. can continue in the role as hegemon in the pursuit of primacy, but the rest of the world should pay for it. That is so much hubris. So it just boggles the mind, right? That, I mean, that they think it is one thing, but that they come out and say it openly is, I know some people had hope that the Trump administration would represent some kind of break with the past, and there's been some break in methodology, right? But ultimately, again, the Trump administration doesn't even intend to abandon hegemony. They just want to force the rest of the world to pay for it. So, as far as I'm concerned, battle lines are drawn. Now the Chinese are stepping up to the plate as well.
Mark, you mentioned the case of Yemen. We know that in Yemen, Donald Trump has decided to go and fight them. They say this time is going to be different. We're not going to fight the way that the Biden administration was implementing, was doing. It's going to be something different. And we know that they tried everything against Yemen, short of nuclear bombs. And even bunker buster bombs, they tried, they have failed. And CNN reported $1 billion they have used in a short period of time.
And
How?
not just $1 billion, but $1 billion worth of missiles and air defense missiles that the US is already short of both on and can't afford, right, continuing to supply Ukraine, right, on one hand, a war with Iran on the other, continuing to play whack-a-mole in the desert against the Houthis. Oh, we're supposed to be preparing to solve this missile gap with China. US is militarily overstretched, right? And this senseless game of whack-a-mole against the Houthis, the missiles and the air defense missiles that are expended and have not stopped the Houthis from continuing to launch their own strikes, on Israeli allied shipping or on Israel itself. I don't see what's different myself. I can't identify anything that is different. I mean, if they think that they're going after more general targets, it hasn't had any effect yet, right? I mean, it's killed more Yemenis, but that just generates more willing Ar Salah movement, recruitments, right? I mean, that's the same problem that Israel is having in Gaza. Yes, they've been going after Hamas for over a year now, going on 2 years, and has that significantly reduced Hamas's numbers? No, because for every Israeli civilian they kill or a Palestinian civilian they kill, they just generate 2 or 3 more Hamas members. That's the same thing here. The Houthis have endured years of US backed Saudi and UAE bombing and airstrikes and everything on their country, and they took it, and they know how to hide things. They know how, and to distribute things, and you can take out a launcher here and this there, and they're already the poorest country in the world, and no one can deal with them militarily. It's
Mark, they
this
were short. They were short of targets in Yemen. That's why Donald Trump should share a video that they're killing civilians.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable.
I don't know what they think. I have heard repeatedly they have launched this rumor has been leaking out of Washington that they're considering sending ground troops into Yemen. I I I imagine in the Kremlin they're just like, do it, do it. Beijing, right? Do it, right? Everyone's like, yeah, you need to get stuck in another Middle East quagmire like that, right? I can't believe. I want to say that I don't believe the Trump administration is stupid enough to do something like that, but hey, they just launched tariffs against the world and were forced to walk them back within a week. So I can't even say that maybe they will. Maybe they actually could. I don't think it's likely, but I think the Pentagon would try to talk them out of it because they're a little more level headed to a degree. But the U.S. has too many problems. They're too overstretched. They've got this particularly, again, their Achilles heel right now for the U.S. military is their shortage and their inability in the short term, probably through the medium term, to ramp up the production of missiles and air defense missiles, right? That they both need for a conflict with Iran, for a conflict with China, or to continue escalating a conflict with Russia in Ukraine. They're overstretched, and their military industrial complex is not up to meeting that challenge now. And they can't even beat the Houthis. And they think that they're going to take on China and the Taiwanese Straits and the South China Sea. Man, that's it's madness. It's just divorced. It's a divorce from reality and an unwillingness to admit that the U.S. is just not a hyperpower anymore, not in relation to the rest of the world. There's been too much proliferation of missile technology and drone technology and AIs and everything else. It's a new military world, and the U.S. just, they can be first among equals and still not able to defeat the Houthis in Yemen. That's, you know, uh, says something about the state of warfare in the world and how much state power can be brought to bear on any particular problem with the goal of solving ultimately a political issue. Doesn't work so well.
Right after we've learned that there are going to be some sort of talks, I don't know, direct or indirect, whatever that would be, between the United States and Iran in Oman. We had on April 8th, we had a meeting among Russia, China, and Iran. They were talking about nuclear program of Iran. And tomorrow it's going to be the meeting between the two parties in Oman. And today, Witkoff, which is responsible for the talks, is in Russia. Do you think that he's going to demand something in the case of Iran? He's going to try to, I don't know, convince Putin, try to say that this gonna let's talk on the issue of Iran, let's coordinate on the issue of Iran. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think it's quite possible, again, that Trump realizes how much he needs Russia, and he is looking for leverage, or for Russia to not use leverage in this particular situation. If they start using words like demand, well, that's going to be a mistake. I mean, that is not the way it's going to work. Russia and Iran have a new and improved strategic partnership. It was just ratified by the Russian Senate in the last 24 hours. If Trump is smart, or any of his people are smart, that Witkoff will be coming hat in hand and asking for Russian assistance, right, on this. And Russia doesn't want Iran to have nuclear weapons, but what they're providing Iran with, as most people assess as part of their strategic partnership, is a conventional deterrent in the form of Russia helping Iran build up an air defense and electronic warfare network in the country. Now, of course, the U.S. and Israel are furious about that. But they're not going to get everything they want in Iran. If they think they are, they're badly mistaken. So, could there be some type of deal struck? Right? Is that what Witkoff is there? We'll do this on Ukraine if you do this on Iran. Russia doesn't like these sort of things, these promises behind the back, this week and the nod, right? Gorbachev, was promised such things about the expansion of NATO and the like, and we all know how that ended. And I think Russia is would demand a lot more than promises from the Trump administration, right? And they're not likely to sell out Iran. They're willing to deal as a mediator with Iran, right? But they will do that from a different level, not selling them out, in the back alley. That's not what Russia, I think, would do at all. But what Putin could, get out of this again is, you want our help on this. You want our help negotiating with Iran and saving yourself another war and some face there. Well, then you need to walk away from Ukraine. We don't care how you do it. That is maybe something that is being discussed. I would think that probably the reality is not quite that big and sexy, The reality is probably on a lower level of that rather than such general terms. But we'll find out going forward.
It's not just the case of Iran. It's the case of Ukraine. It was the case of Ukraine, if you remember the way that the Biden administration somehow was forcing Iran and China, especially, not to help Russia during the conflict in Ukraine. They did everything. They sent a lot of people, officials, to China to talk with them, and but Mark, in my opinion, what's going on? The the main target is China. Is We know that what's going on in Ukraine, how important Ukraine is for Russia, and what's important for Iran, and what's going on with Iran in the Middle East. But when you see the links, all get to Beijing, all get to China and the competition. They want to they wanted to weaken Russia, which wasn't working, it didn't work. And right now it seems that the Middle East, we know that how important Middle East is in terms of the security for Russia and China. How
More
I
so for
wonder,
China.
yeah, exactly. China, that's why I'm talking about the main target is China. I would wonder how China sees this sort of position of the United States in the Middle East.
Well, I mean, I think you're seeing where China is by their quid pro quo tit for tat tariff hikes right now up to 125% on U.S. goods. China is in a fighting mood, right? I mean, when I say fighting, I don't know. Of course, that literally mean war, right? I don't think that's necessarily right on the cards, but they're not going to kowtow or deal with the Trump administration, right? In fact, I think they probably correctly believe that if they showed any weakness whatsoever, that Trump would just work to exploit and take advantage of that, or read it as weakness, rather than a willingness to negotiate, to find zero sum options, and positive for everyone, that sort of thing that the Chinese love talking about. But the real question is, of course, can you separate Russia and China, or Russia and China and Iran now, right? I mean, again, it is all goes back to this clip of Joe Biden in the 90s, then as on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. This video that's out. Probably most of the people out there watching this have already seen this, where Joe Biden was laughing about pushing then NATO expansion down Russia's throat, and that the Russians had came to him and said, "Well, if you keep doing this, we're going to have to turn to China." And he thought that was funny. And he's like, "You turn to China, right? Like, are you serious? Right? What are you going to turn to Iran next?" Right? We're the only game in town. You've got no one else to go to. You're just going to have to take it. He thought that was funny, right? Where are we today, right? Is Russia and China and Iran have been pushed together by the United States, and they keep looking for space. They keep looking for a gap, something to wedge into and exploit between Russia and China and Iran. And in the last 3 years of the conflict in Ukraine, they haven't found it. And they've been looking really hard for it, right? The Biden administration's focus was on Russia, right? They wanted to finish Russia off and move on to China and ignore the Middle East, but instead they ended up getting stuck on Russia in Ukraine and losing that. But they couldn't get China to stop trading with Russia. They couldn't get Russia and Iran have been doing active military exchange and cooperation, now strengthening, as well as vastly improving economic relations with the North-South corridor, and as well. So it's not a question of it's all about China, because at this point it's not just China. It's Russia, China, and Iran, and potentially some others as well, and looking to try to find the light of day in between the three of them, and they're having a hard problem. And there's, I think, maybe at some level realizing the geopolitical catastrophe that they have produced by pushing these three countries together. Rather than using a divide and conquer that Nixon and Kissinger did with exploiting the Sino-Soviet split. They tried to take on all three at the same time out of arrogance, right? Out of belief that they didn't have to compromise with any one of them, and it's led them to this situation, right? And they want to go after Iran, they've got to deal with Russia, and they've got to consider China. They want to, a trade war with China. Well, then now they have to consider their trade with Russia and with Iran. They keep, it's circular. They keep looking, for an in against one, and they find themselves confronted always by the other two now, right? Even without some type of formal alliance, military alliance between the three, that may not even be necessary, because they just, to such a high degree, their foreign policy and their national interests have reached a point of convergence. And it's really a question for that the entire world should regard that the stability, primarily of the Russian-Chinese bipolar relationship as the single most important bilateral relationship in the world, right? The foundation of a multipolar world is the Russian-Chinese partnership. And the first extension of that is the Russian-Chinese-Iranian partnership. And a multipolar world will rise or sink on the stability of, first the Russian-Chinese relationship, and then the triad, the tripole relationship of Russia, China, Iran, and then eventually, maybe other countries can be added into that. But for instance, China directly spoke to India over the last few days and said, you should side with us against Trump's trade war. And the Indians are like, crickets chirping. We're going to cut a deal behind closed doors with the U.S., and we think we'll have a deal with the autumn. But good luck with that. Good luck with that, right? So India is not at a place yet where they are willing to break with the West and contribute to the stability of that model. Maybe someday they will be, but they're not there now. That's for sure. They're still trying to have it good both ways, and they can't. Brazil is too far afield geopolitically, too concerned with domestic matters. It seems to me Lula's options are tied. He doesn't want to become the object of U.S. wrath. So Brazil is mostly staying quiet. But every once in a while, they get demands from the U.S. like to provide artillery shells to Ukraine, and Lula throws him the finger when he can, what he can do, and the like. Brazil, of course, is not in the same position as Russia or China, so they have to be more careful. But there is potential, and we're looking forward to a moment on May 9th, which is Victory Day, and it is the 80th anniversary of the defeat of Nazi Germany and its European fascist allies. And Xi Jinping is going to be there. right? The Chinese leader. And there are reports, again, that Modi and Lula will be there as well. That is a significant show of strength by Russia and of the multipolar world standing together. Uh, I can't imagine. I think the Western press will probably mostly just try to ignore that whole thing and not mention it.
For
Not talk.
sure.
They don't even like to mention BRICS, right? They just try not to talk about it. I think as well, but that is going to be a moment, and it's coming. You know, in it will be in the midst of what I'm sure will be an ongoing trade war going on, and Trump will be increasingly getting desperate, not getting what he wants from Russia on Ukraine, and it will just be a show of unity, right? And I think of a proper remembrance of history as well. Of course, that's in there as well. But I think that will be an important event. I think that will be, as far as such symbolic events will go, it will be an important one, and it will show that there is a degree of unity between the BRICS members, right? Beyond beyond just rhetoric, because all coming to Moscow to stand together, there's political capital that will be expended in that.
Let's see what would happen, Mark. It seems that I'm not that much concerned. I don't think that Donald Trump wants, in the case of Ukraine, he wants to get out. In I don't see, as you mentioned, I don't see they want a war with Iran, because they
Yeah.
have, this administration had the same experience that the Biden administration had with the case of Yemen. They know what would be the disaster. This is just, China just doesn't need to do anything. Just sitting and
Yep.
watching the United States melting down.
Putin was just asked a question about his position on this tariff war between the global tariffs, but in particular, the tariff war developing between the U.S. and China, and he related a proverb of uh, the monkeys looking down out of the tree and seeing two tigers fighting. And the one monkey says, "Well, what should we do?" And the wise monkey says, "We should sit back and do nothing, and let your enemies self destruct." That's in this case, of course. Russia, of course, does not see China as an enemy, but they're certainly not going to wade into this trade dispute as well. They're not, of course, or they're not going to stop trade with China at U.S. demand either. Of course, they will give China, in its moment of confrontation with the U.S., an equal level of support that China gave Russia over the last few years. Right now, China will become the tip of the spear, perhaps, instead of Russia. But this is all factored on Trump, though, finding a way out of the Ukraine mess. And I'm not so sure that he will be able to find and maneuver his way out of that mess, because he's still the US president. And the minute he became president, he owned that war against Russia, right? And he doesn't want to continue it, but he also doesn't want to lose. And that's what it would be, the US losing a war against Russia. So it's a very tough thing. There is so much domestic and international political forces bent on the continuation of that conflict, because they can't accept a Russian victory. Right now, can they avert it? No, that's not something that. But pointing out that logical flaw is not something. They will hope for a black swan that something will change until, well past it's all over. But they will not give in because it is ideological. It is a question of exceptionalism and their view of themselves and their place in the world and what Russia's and of course Iran and China's proper place in that world is or is not. So they just can't accept a Russian victory. So they might want once again to pivot to China, but I think they're probably going to get stuck with Russia and the Middle East again, just like the Biden administration did.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mark, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
Thanks, yeah, it's always fun having a chat with you, Nima. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Take care, Mark. Bye-bye.
Cheers.